There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room after you have heard something you cannot unhear. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of a woman sitting very still at her kitchen table with a phone in her hand, the call still technically connected, her son's voice still drifting through the speaker from whatever room he has wandered into, and the words he just said hanging in the air around her like smoke from a fire that nobody else in the house can smell. She has nothing left to give us. He said it the way men say things they have been thinking for a long time, easily, casually, with the particular lightness of a conviction so settled it no longer requires lowering your voice. My name is Eleanor Voss. I am 71 years old. I raised one child, Richard, and I have spent the last 4 years watching him forget that. The morning he forgot to end the call, I was sitting at the same kitchen table where I had helped him with his homework when he was 9, where I had signed the papers for his college loans at 22, where I had opened the card he sent for my 65th birthday. A card, not a visit, though he lived 40 minutes away. I was drinking tea. The good kind. The loose-leaf kind my late husband Arthur used to order in bulk from a shop in Edinburgh because he said life was too short for tea bags. I still order it from the same shop. I suppose that is the kind of thing that does not change. CTA. If this story has already found the place it was meant to find, hit that like button and subscribe to Sarah Mitchell, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. She always said the women who stay quiet the longest know the most. Let's find out if that's true. The call had come in at 8:17 that morning. Richard checking in, or what passes for checking in, which is to say a question about whether I had spoken to the insurance company about my roof, followed by a question about whether I had any plans for the upcoming long weekend, followed by the particular kind of silence that means the call is winding down, and nobody has said anything that matters. "I'll let you go, Mom." That's what he said. That is always what he says. Except this time, he didn't let me go. He set the phone down, on the counter, I imagine, or on the arm of the couch, and walked away. And the line stayed open, and I sat there with my tea going cold while his life continued in the background without him knowing I could hear it. I heard the television, a sports channel. Then Cassandra's voice, his wife's voice, that particular clipped precision she uses when she is making a point she considers obvious. "Did you ask her about Thanksgiving?" "Not yet." "Rick, we need to know. My parents are flying in, and I'm not doing 2 dinners." A pause. And then, "And I want you to understand that what I felt in that moment was not shock. I want you to understand that, because what came next did not surprise me the way it might have surprised a woman who had not been paying attention. I had been paying attention for a very long time. She has nothing left to give us. We've gotten what we could out of her. I'm not spending another weekend over there pretending." And then, softer, Cassandra. "So what do you want to do?" And then, quieter still, Richard. "I'll figure it out." I set the phone down on the table, very gently, the way you set something down when you are thinking about something else entirely. I finished my tea. And then I opened my laptop, and I wrote one email. But before I tell you what was in that email, before I tell you what happened next, what happened 3 weeks later, what happened in a lawyer's conference room on a Tuesday morning when my son finally understood what he had said into an open phone line, I need to tell you about Eleanor Voss. The Eleanor Voss that Richard believed existed, and the Eleanor Voss who was actually sitting at that kitchen table, because those are not the same woman. They have never been the same woman, and the distance between them is the entire story. Richard knew certain things about his mother. He knew she lived in the house on Birchwood Lane where he had grown up, a 4-bedroom colonial with a garden that had gone slightly wild since Arthur died, because Eleanor had always preferred reading to pruning and had only ever maintained the roses out of deference to her husband's feelings about them. He knew she had a pension from the university, where she had worked for 11 years as an administrative director. Not a large pension, but a reliable one. He knew she drove a 7-year-old Volvo that she kept scrupulously clean. He knew she had some savings. He did not know how much, because he had never asked directly, and the times he had circled the subject, during conversations about her roof, her furnace, whether she had thought about her long-term arrangements, she had answered in the particular way that mothers of a certain generation answer questions about money, which is to say, with enough vagueness to suggest there was nothing exciting to report. He thought she was comfortable. He thought she was fine. He thought she was a woman of 71, living on the ordinary resources of a woman of 71, and that what she had left to give, financially, logistically, emotionally, was diminishing in the natural and expected way of things. He was wrong about all of it. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what Richard was right about. He was right that Eleanor Voss lived simply. She did. She bought the same tea. He drove the same Volvo, kept the garden at exactly the level of wildness that Arthur would have called character, and Cassandra called a liability. She ate dinner at the kitchen table with a book propped against the salt shaker. She took long walks on Thursday mornings along the reservoir path near the university, nodding at the other early walkers, occasionally stopping to speak to a dog. She did not drive a different car on Fridays. She did not have a vacation property nobody knew about. She did not conduct her other life visibly. That was always the thing about Eleanor Voss. She had spent 40 years being the kind of woman who was easy to underestimate, and she had come to understand, slowly and then all at once, that this was not a disadvantage. Arthur used to say that she was the most dangerous person he had ever met, and he meant it as the highest compliment he knew how to give. She missed him every single day, but she was not, as Richard had come to assume, adrift without him. Richard and Cassandra lived in a house that was too large for the two of them and their son Thomas, and they knew it, and they had decided to frame this as success rather than excess, which is the particular cognitive adjustment that people make when they have bought something they cannot entirely afford. The house was in a development called the Reserve at Halcyon Creek, which had neither a reserve nor a creek, but did have a homeowners association with strong opinions about lawn edging. It had 4 bedrooms, a 3-car garage currently occupied by 2 cars, and a collection of sporting equipment that Richard had purchased in ambitious phases. Golf, then cycling, then a kayak that had never touched water, and a kitchen that Cassandra had renovated 18 months ago at a cost she had described to Eleanor as not too bad, all things considered. The renovation had cost $62,000. Eleanor knew this because Thomas had told her, in the frank and uncalculated way of 14-year-olds, during one of their Thursday afternoon calls, which Cassandra did not know about and would not have encouraged. Mom cried about it a little, Thomas had said. Not because of the money, because of the backsplash. She ordered the wrong one, and it came in, and Dad said it was fine. But you could tell he didn't think it was fine. What did she do? Ordered the right one. They returned the wrong one and ordered the right one, and it cost extra. And is the backsplash nice? A pause. It's a backsplash. Or Grandma. Eleanor had smiled at that for a long time. The point is this. Richard and Cassandra were a household that spent freely on the assumption that the ground would hold. They had a financial advisor for their portfolio. Richard himself occupied a mid-level position at a wealth management firm, which he found gratifying in the way that men find gratifying any profession that permits them to describe themselves as managing other people's money. And they had certain expectations about the future that were built, as such expectations often are, on a foundation that had not been examined in some time. Part of that foundation was Eleanor. Not in any way that Richard would have admitted to, or possibly even recognized. He was not a man who sat down and calculated his mother's assets as a line in a personal ledger. He was simply a man who had grown accustomed to certain things, and some of those things had to do with his mother. The money she had pressed into his hand at Thomas's christening, $20,000, cash, in an envelope, because the baptismal suit was expensive and I know you're stretched. He had taken it without protest. The check she had written toward the down payment on Birchwood Lane when they were first married, $40,000, which Richard had described to Cassandra as what was left of Dad's life insurance, because it was simpler than explaining the conversation he'd had with Eleanor, where she had simply said, "Take it. I want you to have a home. Don't make a thing of it." The contributions to Thomas's college fund, made quietly and consistently, that Richard tracked in a spreadsheet he had never shared with his wife, because Cassandra had opinions about gifts from in-laws that Richard found exhausting to navigate. The Sunday dinners, before they stopped coming to Sunday dinners. The babysitting, before Thomas outgrew babysitting. The time Eleanor had driven 4 hours to spend a week with them when Cassandra had her appendix out and Richard had a conference he could not miss, and she had never mentioned it again, and neither had they. None of these things had made Richard feel indebted. They had made him feel secure. There is a difference, and the difference is everything. Cassandra Voss had not always disliked her mother-in-law. In the early years, the first 3, when perhaps 4, she had found Eleanor impressive in the way that one finds impressive a woman who is clearly more capable than the situation calls for. Eleanor had been gracious at the wedding, had sent the right gifts, had never once made the remarks about grandchildren that Cassandra had braced herself for. The shift had been gradual. These things always are. It began, Eleanor believed, around the time that Cassandra's own mother had moved closer to them. A woman named Diane, who was louder than Eleanor, more present, more willing to perform the rituals of grandmotherly enthusiasm that Eleanor had always found slightly exhausting, and who had accordingly become Thomas's preferred grandmother in the way that children choose the person who makes the biggest fuss. Cassandra had begun to measure Eleanor against Diane, and Eleanor, who had never been interested in making a fuss, had come up short in the comparison. This seemed to have annoyed Cassandra in the particular way that people are annoyed when a person refuses to compete for something. And then, more recently, in the last 2 years since Arthur's death, there had been a different quality to it. Less competition, more management. Eleanor had been managed. She understood this with complete clarity, the way you understand something you have chosen not to name until the right moment. She had been managed into a smaller and smaller version of her role in the family. Not through cruelty exactly, but through the accumulation of small adjustments, each one individually defensible, collectively a kind of quiet erasure. She was not asked to the school events anymore. Thomas said he'd rather keep it small. You know how teenagers are. She was not consulted on the family vacation. We figured you'd find it too much travel. It was all last minute. She was not invited to the holiday party that Cassandra hosted every December for her work colleagues and their partners, and, apparently, Diane. It's more of a work thing. You wouldn't know anyone. She ate at the kitchen counter when she visited, because the dining room is sort of taken over with Cassandra's project right now. The project being a collection of decorative items that had never been arranged and would not be, but whose presence on the dining table served the useful purpose of keeping Eleanor's visits contained to the kitchen. She was handed dishes to wash when she visited. Not asked, handed. The way you hand a dish to a member of the household staff. She was spoken to, at dinners, in the tone of someone speaking to a person who might not fully follow the conversation. A slight over-enunciation, a tendency to summarize rather than engage, a way of including her in discussions by addressing remarks to her that were clearly already settled. "Mom, we've decided to do Christmas in February this year. Does that work for you?" The question already answered. Richard followed Cassandra's lead in this, as he followed her lead in most domestic things, with the particular compliance of a man who has decided that his wife's social architecture is not worth the energy of contesting. He was not unkind to his mother. He was absent, present in body at the occasional dinner, absent in every way that counted. Eleanor had watched all of this. She had not commented. She had not complained. She had brought Thomas the books he asked for, and the specific brand of dark chocolate he'd discovered on a school trip, and the occasional handwritten note that she left in his jacket pocket when she visited, because Thomas still had the quality that small children have before the family teaches it out of them, the ability to see a person rather than a role. Thomas Voss was 14, and he had his grandmother's eyes. Not literally, though there was a quality of steadiness in them that Arthur had always called the Voss look, but in the sense that he watched things. He paid attention. He was a quiet boy who drew extremely detailed architectural sketches in the margins of his school notebooks, and who had developed, over the past year or so, just a habit of calling Eleanor on Thursday afternoons, because as he had explained when she'd asked, "You're the only person I talk to who doesn't have an agenda." She had found this both flattering and a little sad. Thomas knew things that his parents assumed he did not know. He knew that his grandmother visited less frequently than she used to, and that the reduction in visits corresponded with a period when his mother had taken to describing Eleanor's presence in the house with the particular vocabulary of inconvenience. "She's coming Friday, so I'll need to be here," rather than welcome. He knew that his grandmother had sent him a birthday card this year with a check for $200 and a note that said, in her even handwriting, "I know your parents prefer to manage the money side of things, so I'm sending this to you directly. Buy yourself something you actually want, not something sensible. Love, Grandma E." And that his mother had deposited the check into his college fund without mentioning it. He knew because he had been standing on the landing, invisible in the way teenagers are invisible in their own homes. That when his father had told his mother about the phone call last fall, where Eleanor had mentioned the roof repairs, Cassandra had said, "She needs to start thinking about what makes sense long term." And his father had said, "I know." And his mother had said, "I mean financially and otherwise." And his father had said, "I know, Cassie." And neither of them had used the word home, but both of them had meant it. Thomas had not told his grandmother this. He was 14, not heartless. But he called her every Thursday. And he asked how the garden was. And he listened when she talked about Arthur. And he had once spent an entire afternoon helping her reorganize the bookshelves in the study without being asked to, and had done it with the particular thoroughness of someone who understands that a library is not just books, but a person's mind made visible. And Eleanor had served him tea in Arthur's cup, the good one, the one she never used for anyone else, and had not said anything about it, and neither had he. He was the best of them. Eleanor had known this for some time. Here is what Eleanor Voss's son did not know about his mother. He did not know that his father Arthur, who had spent 32 years running a logistics software company that specialized in supply chain infrastructure for mid-sized manufacturers, had not built that company alone. The public narrative of Voss Integrated Systems. And there was a public narrative because the company had been acquired 18 months ago in a transaction that had generated a modest amount of business press coverage, positioned Arthur as the founder and visionary, which he had been. What the coverage had not emphasized, because Arthur had not emphasized it, was that the early architecture of the company's proprietary system had been co-developed by his wife. Eleanor had a degree in mathematics from a university in Ohio that she had attended on a full scholarship in 1974, which was not a common thing for a woman from her particular corner of Pennsylvania in 1974, and which her mother had called unnecessarily ambitious. She had worked in systems analysis for 8 years before she and Arthur had married, but before Richard had been born, before the decision had been made, hers, not Arthur's, though Arthur had never entirely forgiven himself for accepting it, that she would step back from paid work to manage the household and the child, and eventually, the invisible but essential administrative architecture of the company that Arthur was building in the spare bedroom of their first house. She had not received a salary. She had received a 38% ownership stake, because Arthur Voss had been, whatever his other failings, a man who understood value and believed in honoring it. Richard knew his father had owned the company. He did not know his mother had owned 38% of it. This was not an accident. It was a decision Eleanor and Arthur had made together, early on, now based on a clear-eyed assessment of what Richard was like, their son's relationship to money, to expectation, to the comfortable assumption that the people around him would continue to provide, and what might happen if he knew. They had planned to tell him eventually. Arthur had died before eventually arrived. 18 months ago, Voss Integrated Systems had been acquired by a European logistics conglomerate for a figure that had briefly appeared in an industry newsletter under the headline, Regional Software Firm Finds Strategic Exit. Eleanor's 38% had yielded $22 million after taxes and fees. The money sat in a series of accounts managed by a wealth advisor named Patricia Chen, who had been Arthur's advisor and was now Eleanor's, and who addressed Eleanor as Mrs. Voss's in correspondence and Eleanor in the room, and who had, over the 18 months since the acquisition, constructed a portfolio that was, in Patricia's words, positioned for what you actually want, which appears to be everything continuing exactly as it is while ensuring it continues exactly as it is for the next 50 years. Eleanor had also retained, as part of the estate Arthur had structured with considerable care and a very good attorney, ownership of 3 commercial properties in the city, a mixed-use building downtown, a small office complex near the university, and a storage facility that was not glamorous but had been generating consistent revenue for 11 years. These were held in a trust whose name was not Eleanor's name and whose existence Richard had no particular reason to suspect. She drove the 7-year-old Volvo because she liked it. She ordered the same tea because Arthur had liked it. She lived in the house on Birchwood Lane because she had chosen to, and because the garden still had his roses, and because the study still had his books, and because leaving felt, at this stage of things, like more trouble than it was worth. Not because she couldn't afford to leave, because she didn't want to. There is a difference. The whole story lives in the difference. Eleanor had been keeping notes, not formal notes, nothing so dramatic as a journal or a ledger. But she had the mathematician's habit of precision, and over the past 2 years, she had found herself making mental records of the things that happened around her, not bitterly, not with any particular plan, but in the way that a person who has spent their life paying attention continues paying attention even when the information is unpleasant. She remembered the evening 3 Decembers ago when Richard had mentioned, in passing, that the kitchen renovation was coming in a little over budget, and had then, without transition, mentioned that it would mean a tighter Christmas for Thomas this year. And Eleanor had said, "Of course," and mailed Thomas a card with a check for $500, and had not been thanked for it. She remembered the spring Sunday when she had arrived for what she believed was a family lunch, only to find Cassandra's mother and sister also present, and had been given a chair at the end of the table that placed her, physically, outside the natural arc of the conversation, a positioning that required the table to be slightly extended and had the effect of making Eleanor's presence feel supplemental, an afterthought who had not been informed that the gathering had expanded. She remembered the call, 8 months ago, when Richard had raised the subject of the house. He had been careful about it. Her son had learned a certain diplomatic vocabulary that she suspected came from his professional training in wealth management, the language of options and thinking about the future, but the shape of it was unmistakable. Had she thought about what might make sense, long-term? Had she considered that the house was perhaps more than one person needed? Had she looked into what properties were going for in Birchwood? "I'm not selling the house, Richard." "Mom, nobody's saying sell. I'm just saying, have you thought about what makes sense?" "The house makes sense." A pause. "What about the upkeep?" "The upkeep is fine." "What about if something happened? You'd be alone." "I am alone. I manage." What she had not said and had filed carefully away. "I could buy another house tomorrow and not notice it in the accounts. I could buy the development where you live and rent it back to you at market rate. I am asking you to tell me, Richard, what it is you're actually asking." She had not said it. She had been deciding, still, what she was dealing with, whether this was her son worrying about his mother, or her son worrying about an inheritance, or something in between that she hadn't yet named. The phone call that morning had named it. The morning of the call had been unremarkable in the particular way that mornings are unremarkable before something happens in them. Eleanor had woken at 6, as she usually did, and had spent an hour in the study with the blinds still down, reading the continuation of a history of the Ottoman Empire that she had started 2 weeks before, and was finding genuinely absorbing. She had made tea at 7. She had watered the 3 plants on the kitchen windowsill, a geranium that had been Arthur's, a small bay tree she used for cooking, and a succulent Thomas had given her 2 years ago that she had kept alive through sheer attentiveness, because Thomas had given it to her, and she had stood at the window for a moment, watching the garden in the early light, the roses slightly past their peak, the grass a little long. She had been thinking about Patricia Chen. She had a call with Patricia scheduled for the following Thursday, a routine quarterly review, and she had been composing mentally the questions she wanted to ask about the real estate trust, whether the downtown building's lease renewal warranted renegotiation, whether the storage facilities management company was still performing to the benchmarks Patricia had established 2 years ago. When the phone rang, she had answered without checking who it was, because she always answered calls from numbers she recognized, and Richard's number was in her phone under his name and the small sailing boat emoji that Thomas had put there last summer, when he'd borrowed her phone to take a picture of a real sailing boat they'd seen at the reservoir. "So, Mom," Richard's voice had that particular quality of someone calling out of obligation rather than desire. Present, attentive enough, already slightly elsewhere. "How are you doing?" "Very well. How are you?" They had talked for 11 minutes. She had said the right things about the garden, about the history book, about the weather. He had said the right things about work, about Thomas's school, about a restaurant they'd tried last week that was apparently quite good. He had asked about the roof, and she had said the roof was fine, because it was. He had asked if she had any plans for the long weekend. Not to invite her, she understood, but to establish whether she had people, whether she required managing. "I'm having lunch with Beverly on Saturday," she said. Beverly Marsh was Eleanor's oldest friend, 83 years old, her former chemistry professor, the only person alive who had known Arthur before Eleanor did, and who still argued that he had been impossible to talk to until Eleanor had taught him how to listen. "And I may go to the museum Sunday. There's an exhibition I've been meaning to see." "Good! Good!" The relief in his voice was so practiced, she almost didn't catch it anymore. She caught it. "Okay, well, I'll let you go, Mom. Take care of yourself, Richard." "You too." She heard the sound of movement. Him setting the phone down, she imagined, on the kitchen counter, where he always left things, or on the arm of the living room couch where Cassandra had told him 17 times not to leave things. The call did not end. The line stayed open. She could hear the slight, ambient hiss of a live connection, and then the television, a sports channel, she thought, or possibly one of those financial news channels Richard watched in the mornings, and then the sound of footsteps. She had started to press the button to end the call herself. She was not sure afterward why she hadn't. Something had made her pause. Some instinct she couldn't name, some quality in the ambient sound of her son's house that had held her still for one more moment. Cassandra's voice. "Did you ask her about Thanksgiving?" "Not yet." "Rick." There was that tone, the one that women use when they are out of patience and have been for some time. "We need to know. My parents are flying in, and I'm not doing 2 dinners." Eleanor sat very still. "I'll call her back." "When?" "I'll call her back, Cassie. Can we—" "I just need to know. It's a simple question." There was a pause. She heard what might have been the sound of a cabinet opening. The kitchen, then. Richard was in the kitchen, and then her son said it. The way he said it was almost the hardest part. Not sharp, not cruel, simply considered. The tone of a man stating a fact that has been established. "She has nothing left to give us. We've gotten what we could out of her. I'm not spending another weekend over there pretending." A silence. Then Cassandra, softer than Eleanor expected. "So what do you want to do?" "I'll figure it out." Footsteps again. A door, somewhere in the house. Eleanor looked at her phone. The call was still connected. 11 minutes and 43 seconds, the display said. She pressed the red button, and the number went to 0, and the kitchen was very quiet. She sat there for what might have been 2 minutes or 20, or she sat there with the geranium on the windowsill and Arthur's tea going cold in her cup, and she was aware of a sensation she had not expected. Not grief, Not anger, not even the cold, settled feeling she sometimes got when something confirmed what she had already known. Something closer to clarity, the kind of clarity that arrives when the last uncertain thing becomes certain. She opened her laptop. She composed an email. The email was addressed to a woman named Harriet Okafor, who was one of the finest estate attorneys in the state, and who had been recommended to Eleanor 3 years ago by a colleague of Patricia Chen's, and who Eleanor had retained 18 months ago for reasons she had described, at the time, as getting things in order. Harriet had understood, as good attorneys understand, so that getting things in order covers a great deal of territory and requires no further explanation until the client is ready to provide it. The email said, "Harriet, I'm ready to move forward with the full restructuring we discussed. I'd like to meet this week if possible. I'll bring the notes I've been keeping. It's time." She pressed send. Then she washed her teacup. Then she put on her coat. Then she walked out into the garden and stood for a moment in the autumn air, with her hand on one of Arthur's roses, the late blooming kind, still holding a few dark red flowers against all reason. And she thought about what her husband used to say when she asked him how he knew when it was time to act. "You wait," he always said. "You watch, and then you know." She knew. There is a kind of work that does not look like work from the outside. Arthur used to call it the architecture of the long game, the decisions made in private that rearrange the future so completely that by the time anyone else notices a change, the change is already finished. He had built his company on this principle. He had built their life on it. And he had, with a great deal of care and a great attorney, and the particular patience of a man who understood both mathematics and human nature, built Eleanor's position on it as well. She had always been the better student of the two of them. He had told her that himself, many times, with a mixture of pride and something almost like relief. Relief she had understood later, that the person he had built a life with was the kind of person who could be trusted with everything. She stood in the garden for a long time after she sent the email. The late roses held their color in the October air, that particular depth of red that only comes at the end of the season, when the plant is spending everything it has left. Eleanor had never been sentimental about roses in the abstract. She found them overdone as a symbol, too easily borrowed. But Arthur's roses she allowed herself to feel something about. He had planted them the year after Richard was born, in a stretch of garden he'd marked out on a piece of graph paper with the same precision he brought to everything, and he had tended them every summer with a consistency that she had found, for 30 years, quietly moving. She stood there until she was cold. Then she went inside and called Beverly Marsh. Beverly answered on the first ring, which she always did, because Beverly Marsh had been waiting for something interesting to happen for most of her 83 years, and had learned that you could not afford to miss calls. "Eleanor, you sound like a woman who has made a decision." "I have." "A large one?" "Large enough." "Should I cancel Saturday's lunch, or will you need it?" "I'll need it." Eleanor pulled her coat tighter and looked at the garden through the window over the sink. "I need to talk it through with someone who knew Arthur." "Tell me just the shape of it," Beverly said. "Not the details. Just the shape." Eleanor thought for a moment. "My son forgot to end a phone call this morning." A pause. Then Beverly said, very quietly, "Ah. Yes. How much did you hear?" "Enough to know what I'd suspected. Enough that I'm done waiting to be sure." "And the email?" "Sent. Harriet will call me tomorrow." Beverly was quiet for a moment, in the way that old friends are quiet. Not absent, just thinking alongside you, which is a different thing entirely. "Are you all right?" "I'm very clear," Eleanor said. "I'm not sure that's the same as all right, but it's what I have. It's enough. I'll see you Saturday. Bring the good tea." She hung up and stood there another moment. The geranium on the windowsill leaned slightly toward the light, the way it always did, in the slow and inexorable way of things that know where they need to go. Eleanor had always admired that about geraniums. Harriet Okafor called at 8:40 the following morning, which was 20 minutes earlier than Eleanor had expected, which told her that Harriet had read the email the previous evening. Harriet was 51, meticulous, and had what she described as a low tolerance for situations that got messy because someone waited too long. She had built her practice on estate planning and had earned, over 22 years, a particular reputation among the kind of clients who had significant assets and complicated families, which was to say, most of her clients, for being the person you called when you were finally ready to stop hoping the situation would resolve itself. Eleanor. Her voice was warm and businesslike in equal measure, which Eleanor had always found exactly right. I got your email. When can you come in? Thursday afternoon, if that works. I'll move things. Bring whatever notes you have and whatever you want Patricia present for. Has she been briefed? I'll call her this morning. Good. I want to have the full picture before we talk about sequencing. A pause. And Eleanor, I just want to say, before we get into the specifics, the restructuring we discussed 18 months ago was designed for exactly this. The mechanisms are already in place. This is not starting from scratch. This is finishing what Arthur started. Eleanor looked at the wall of the study, where Arthur's degrees still hung beside hers, side by side, the way he had hung them the week they moved in, with a spirit level and great ceremony. I know, she said. That's why I waited until I was sure. Richard called back at 2:17 that afternoon. She had been expecting it. Not necessarily that day, but soon. Soon being Richard's equivalent of urgency, which was to say within 48 hours of something he'd remembered he hadn't done. She was in the study reading when the phone lit up, and she set the book down carefully, marking her page with the fold of the dust jacket, and answered. Mom, hey, sorry, I think the call dropped earlier. Did it drop? It may have, she said. You okay? You sound... He searched for a word. Tired? I'm fine. I was reading. Okay? Good. The rhythm of a man moving through a checklist. So listen, Thanksgiving. Cassandra's parents are coming in this year, so we're going to keep it just family, immediate family, and I just wanted to let you know so you could make your own plans. Eleanor let the silence sit for exactly the right length of time. Not long enough to alarm him. Long enough to register. Of course, she said. Beverly will probably do something, right? Or there's that place near you. The one with the pies. I'll be fine, Richard. Okay, great. Because we're going to do a thing in February, a belated holiday thing, when things are less crazy. So there's that to look forward to. She had noticed, in recent years, how often her son described things as being looked forward to on her behalf. As if she required an appointment with her own family offered to her as a consolation. That sounds nice, she said. Great. Okay. Hey, how's the roof? The roof is fine, Richard. Okay, good. All right. I'll let you go. Take care of yourself. You too, Mom. She hung up and sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. There was a particular sensation in conversations like that one. A slight pressure behind the sternum. Not quite sadness, not quite anger. Something more like the awareness of distance. The distance between the conversation that was happening and the conversation that would have to happen eventually. She did not intend to be the one to close that distance. She intended to let Richard close it himself, when the ground shifted far enough beneath him that he had no other choice. She picked up her book and continued reading. If this story has found you, make sure to subscribe to Sarah Mitchell and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. The best of this story is still ahead, and the people who watch to the end are exactly the ones who need to hear it. Patricia Chen had been Arthur's financial advisor for 15 years before she became Eleanor's, and in that transition, the handoff that happened in the weeks after the funeral, say when Eleanor had sat across from Patricia in the same chair Arthur had occupied for a decade and a half, and said simply, "Tell me everything." Patricia had understood that she was dealing with a different kind of client entirely. Arthur had been a visionary. He had been excellent at the large picture and required support with the details. Eleanor was something else. Eleanor had sat across from Patricia for 3 hours that first day, asked questions that Patricia had not been asked before, except by people who had spent careers in finance, and left with a legal pad full of notes, written in a handwriting so even and precise that Patricia had photographed a page later and sent it to her own mother as evidence that people like Eleanor Voss existed. They met by phone on Wednesday morning, and Eleanor outlined what she was thinking. The full restructuring, Patricia said, not as a question. The full restructuring. You're moving everything out of the structures that carry Richard's name. Yes. And I want to look again at the discretionary trust provisions. I want to make sure Thomas is protected separately, not through Richard separately. His own line. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, Eleanor could feel her advisor working through the implications the way a good advisor does, not just the financial ones, but the human ones. Eleanor, Patricia said carefully, if Richard challenges this later, he won't be able to. That's what Harriet is for. I know that. I mean, if he challenges it in the family sense, if this becomes a conversation. It will become a conversation, Eleanor said. Eventually. But by the time it does, the conversation will be about what already exists, not about what I might still do. Those are very different conversations. Another pause. Then Patricia said, with something in her voice that wasn't quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. Arthur used to talk about you in those terms. What terms? Precise ones. Eleanor found she had to look at the window for a moment. The geranium again, leaning toward the light. Thursday, she said. Harriet's office. Can you join by phone? I'll be there in person, Patricia said. This one deserves to be in the room. The offices of Okafor Estate Partners occupied the fourth floor of a building downtown, 3 blocks from the mixed-use property Eleanor owned through the trust, a proximity she had never mentioned to Harriet and had always privately found amusing. Near the conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows and a long table with 8 chairs, and on the Thursday afternoon in question, there were 3 people at it. Eleanor, Harriet, and Patricia, who had driven in from the suburbs and arrived with a leather portfolio and the focused energy of someone who had been looking forward to this particular meeting. Eleanor had brought her notes. Not a legal pad this time, but a small leather notebook, dark green, that she had been using for the past 2 years. Dates, observations, amounts, the careful record of a woman who had learned early in life that the person who controls the documentation controls the narrative. Harriet opened. You've described this to me before as getting things in order. I want to make sure I understand what you mean now, given the timing. So are we talking about a defensive restructuring, protecting assets from a potential challenge, or are we talking about a complete redirection of the estate's ultimate distribution? Both, Eleanor said. In that order. Harriet nodded, made a note. Tell me about Richard's current position relative to the estate. He's named in my will as sole heir, with provisions for Thomas. He's listed as an authorized contact on 3 accounts I use for household expenses. None of the primary accounts. He has no knowledge of the trust structures, no knowledge of the acquisition proceeds, and no knowledge of the commercial properties beyond a passing awareness that Arthur owned real estate. He believes those properties were sold after Arthur died. Were they? No. They were transferred to the trust I established 18 months ago, where Arthur's attorney handled the transfer. There's nothing in my name that points to them. Patricia leaned forward slightly. The current trust structures are solid. What Eleanor is describing is essentially the completion of what Arthur began, shifting the beneficial interests so that Richard is no longer in the primary position. And Thomas? Harriet asked. Thomas gets a separate discretionary trust, funded independently. His education, housing, whatever he needs up to 30. Fully discretionary, administered by Patricia's firm and Beverly Marsh as co-trustees. Eleanor paused. I want Beverly involved. She knew Arthur. She'll understand what I want it used for. Harriet looked up from her notes. You're leaving Richard out of Thomas's trust entirely. I'm ensuring that Thomas's assets can never pass through Richard's hands before they reach Thomas. That's different from leaving him out. It's a meaningful distinction. Harriet wrote something. Who inherits the primary estate, if not Richard? Eleanor had thought about this for a long time, longer than anything else. She had thought about it in the study at night, with Arthur's books around her, and she had thought about it on the Thursday walks by the reservoir, and she had thought about it during one particular Sunday afternoon when she had gone to the company's old offices because she had heard they were being converted into apartments, and she had wanted to see the building once more before it became something else. And she had stood on the pavement outside and looked up at the windows and thought about what Arthur had built and what he had believed it was for. The university, she said, a chair in Arthur's name in the mathematics department, and the firefighters' pension fund for this district. Arthur started his career as a volunteer before the company, and he never stopped believing it mattered. And whatever remains, split between 3 nonprofits that Harriet and Patricia will help me identify, with criteria I'll outline separately. The room was quiet for a moment. Patricia said very quietly, "He would have loved that." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's the point." 2 weeks after the meeting in Harriet's office, Eleanor went to dinner at Richard and Cassandra's house. She had been invited, not to Thanksgiving, yet but to a Sunday in early November that Cassandra had described as a casual thing, come for dinner. The invitation had been offered with the quality of an obligation being discharged, and Eleanor had accepted with the quality of someone who had a reason to be there. She wanted to see the house. She wanted to see Thomas. She wanted to sit at whatever surface Cassandra permitted her and watch her son move through the life he had built and remember it clearly, because soon it would look different to her. She was aware of this. She wanted to see it while it still looked the way it had always looked. Cassandra met her at the door in an apron that suggested a dinner more elaborate than the casual thing advertised. There were candles on the kitchen island. The dining room, Eleanor noted, Ange was no longer occupied by the arrangement project. The decorative items had migrated to the console table in the hallway, and the dining table was set for 4, with the good napkins, which suggested that having Eleanor there mattered in some way that Cassandra would not have acknowledged directly. "You look well," Cassandra said, taking Eleanor's coat. "Thank you. So do you." It was not an unfriendly exchange. It was the exchange of 2 women who had been circling each other for a long time and had developed, over the years, a working vocabulary for navigating the space between them. Eleanor had never disliked Cassandra with the kind of feeling that required management. She had observed her, assessed her, and concluded that her daughter-in-law was a woman of limited imagination, operating from a narrow but coherent set of values, among which family loyalty appeared only when it was convenient, and practicality covered a great deal of territory it had no business covering. Thomas appeared from the stairs in the way that teenagers appear, suddenly, as if materialized, wearing a sweatshirt that said something Eleanor didn't catch, and carrying a paperback that he held closed with one finger marking his page. "Grandma E!" He crossed the kitchen and hugged her with the unreserved physical warmth of someone who had not yet learned to perform affection, which was one of Eleanor's favorite things about him. "I found that book you mentioned, the one about the bridge." "The My Art book?" "Yeah. You were right. It's incredible. He was doing all this stuff in the 30s that they didn't have the math for yet, and he intuited it." Thomas stepped back and held up the paperback. The cover showed a photograph of an elegant Swiss bridge curving across a mountain gorge. How did he know it would hold? He understood the principles deeply enough that the specific numbers followed naturally, Eleanor said. That's usually how it works. You understand the thing well enough, and the details take care of themselves. Thomas considered this in the particular way he considered things, fully, without self-consciousness. Then he said, "Is that how you do things?" She looked at him for a moment. 14 years old, with Arthur's steadiness in his face, asking a question with a precision he probably didn't know was remarkable. Yes, she said. Ah, that's exactly how. Richard emerged from the back of the house, drink in hand, wearing the slightly overworked expression of a man who had been told to be home by 6 and had made it by 6:15. Mom, good, you found us. He kissed her cheek. Smells good, Cassie. They sat down to dinner 40 minutes later. Eleanor ate at the dining table. The good table, the set napkins, a chair that positioned her within the conversation rather than at its margin. She noticed this. She did not comment on it. She watched. Richard talked about work. A client who was restructuring a portfolio ahead of the new year, a conference he'd attended in the fall. Cassandra talked about a renovation to the upstairs bathroom that was apparently in the planning stages. Thomas ate silently for a while. C then began asking Eleanor questions about the Maillard book, and the conversation between them was so natural and so complete that at one point, Eleanor noticed Cassandra watching it with an expression that was almost surprised, as if she had forgotten that her son and his grandmother had a world between them that she was not part of. After dinner, Richard asked if she wanted to stay for coffee. I'll head back, Eleanor said. I have an early call tomorrow. Work call? He smiled when he said it, the indulgent smile he used for her occasional mentions of meetings and calls, which he had apparently decided were civic commitments or social engagements of some kind. Financial call, she said. Oh, the pension stuff? Something like that. She let it rest there, vague, the way she had let it rest for years, and watched him accept it without examining it. Thomas walked her to the door. In the hallway, while Cassandra was in the kitchen and Richard was putting on his phone, Thomas handed her a piece of paper, folded twice, the way kids fold notes. I drew you something, he said. From the bridge book, one of the arches. I was trying to figure out how he calculated the curve. She unfolded it. A careful pencil sketch, detailed and technically precise, the arch of the Schwanbach Bridge, rendered in the margins of a piece of graph paper. In the corner, in Thomas's small, even handwriting, for Grandma E. The math is behind the beauty. Thomas, she said, it's just a sketch. No, she said, it isn't. She drove home along Birchwood Lane, with the sketch on the passenger seat and the specific, more crystalline quality of knowing exactly what you're doing and why. Harriet had told her, at the close of their Thursday meeting, that the restructuring would take approximately 6 to 8 weeks to complete. The trust amendments, the re-registration of the beneficial interests, the updates to the will, everything quiet, everything legal, everything already designed for exactly this. 6 to 8 weeks. Eleanor had nodded and said she could wait. She had, after all, been waiting for years. Harriet's firm worked quickly, as firms do when the client is prepared, and the documentation is clean, and the attorney has spent 18 months building toward exactly this configuration. By the 3rd week of November, the will had been amended. Richard's name remained. This was important. This was deliberate. But where he had been the primary heir, he was now a conditional beneficiary, and the conditions were specific. The primary estate passed to the charitable structures Eleanor had outlined: the mathematics chair, the firefighters' pension supplement, the 3 nonprofits. Richard received a fixed sum, generous by ordinary standards, humbling by the standard of what he had assumed, and a letter explaining the rest. The letter had been Harriet's idea. You should write it yourself, she had said, in your own words, so he can't say later he didn't understand. Eleanor had written it on a Sunday morning in the study, at Arthur's desk, with the same green notebook open beside her. She wrote it in one sitting. She did not write it in anger. She wrote it in the particular calm of someone who has looked at a situation from every angle over a very long time, and found that the view is the same from all of them. She did not show it to anyone except Beverly, who read it over lunch and handed it back without speaking, and then poured them both more tea and said, finally, Arthur would have kept this. He'd have carried it around for years. Thomas's trust was established separately, a discretionary structure administered by Patricia and Beverly, funded with a portion of the acquisition proceeds that was his alone, independent of anything Richard controlled or could access. It had no conditions beyond age and character, which Beverly and Patricia were jointly authorized to assess. Eleanor had written a separate letter for Thomas too. Not for now, but for later. To be given to him at 25, which was the age Eleanor had calculated as the point at which a person is old enough to understand the history of a gift without being overwhelmed by it. The commercial properties remained in the trust. The primary accounts remained with Patricia. The household accounts, the modest, ordinary accounts that Richard knew about, that looked like a woman of 71's ordinary resources, remained exactly as they were. Nothing in Eleanor's daily life changed. She drove the Volvo. She ordered the tea. She walked the reservoir path on Thursdays and nodded at the other early walkers. She called Thomas every Thursday afternoon. She kept her next quarterly review with Patricia for December. She sent Richard and Cassandra a Thanksgiving card. A nice one, with a personal note. The kind a mother writes because she is a mother, and because some things do not change simply because other things have. She did not tell Richard what she had done. She was not finished yet. Beverly Marsh had a theory about the way things worked, which she had developed over 83 years of watching families operate, and which she had arrived at through the same process that good scientists arrive at theories: sustained observation, honest assessment, and a willingness to accept the data rather than the conclusion you preferred. Her theory was this: people almost always tell you exactly what they are. They tell you in the small things, in the ways they speak about others, when those others are not in the room, in the things they call practical that are actually convenient, and in the language they use when they believe they are being realistic, but are actually being selfish. They tell you, and the only question is whether you are willing to listen. Richard told you years ago, Beverly said. They were at Beverly's dining table, the one she had inherited from her own mother, and had been threatening to refinish for a decade without ever doing it. He told you with the down payment he never acknowledged properly. He told you with the Christmas without a visit. He told you when he talked about the house as if it were an asset to be liquidated rather than your home. I wanted to be sure, Eleanor said. You were sure. You were being fair. Beverly poured tea with the precision of a woman who had been doing it for 60 years. There's a difference. You were being fairer to him than he was to you. He's my son. Yes, and you love him. Those two things are both true, and they're not the same thing as owing him what he expected. Beverly set down the teapot. What he expected, Eleanor, what he was counting on, that was never yours to give. It was Arthur's, and Arthur gave it to you, and you are entirely within your rights to decide what it becomes. Eleanor looked at the sketch Thomas had given her. She'd brought it to show Beverly, who had held it for a long time, and then asked to keep a copy, which Eleanor had photographed for her on the phone. The boy is extraordinary, Beverly said. He is. He'll be all right regardless, but it doesn't hurt to make sure. No, Eleanor agreed. It doesn't. Beverly looked at her for a moment, the long, clear look of a very old friend. What are you waiting for now? Eleanor thought about it. For the moment, when the truth stops being something I know privately and becomes something Richard knows. And when is that? When it has to be. When there's something that forces the conversation. She picked up her tea. I've learned with Richard that there's no point forcing it before then. He won't hear it. He'll hear it when he has to. And then he'll know exactly what he said into an open phone line on a Tuesday morning in October. And he'll know what I heard. And he'll know what I did about it. She set the cup down. And that will be enough. Beverly was quiet for a moment. Eleanor, she said finally, you are the most patient woman I have ever known. Arthur always said that was my best quality. He was right. Beverly picked up her own cup. And possibly his most important contribution was recognizing it. They sat in the particular comfort of very old friendship, the kind that requires no explanation and no performance. And outside the window, the November sky was the particular gray of late autumn, and the trees were almost bare, and everything was very still. There is something important to understand about what Eleanor had built, or rather, what Arthur had begun and Eleanor had completed. It was not a trap. She did not think of it as a trap. A trap implies that someone is being caught in something they didn't know existed, and Eleanor was not interested in catching Richard. She was interested in something more precise than that. She was interested in consequences, the natural, orderly, proportional kind. The kind that arrive not because someone designed them to hurt, but because someone designed them to be fair. And fairness, when it finally lands on the people who have been depending on unfairness, feels like devastation. Richard had been counting on something that was not his. He had been counting on it for years. Not consciously, perhaps not even cynically, but in the reliable, settled, unexamined way of people who have never been asked to question the ground beneath them. He had made decisions based on it. He had said things, into an open phone line, without knowing she was listening, that revealed the precise shape of what he believed he was owed. The mechanism Eleanor had built did not punish Richard for those words. It simply ensured that what he was counting on was no longer available. It redirected Arthur's life's work, their life's work, toward the things Arthur had actually cared about, the mathematics that had made everything possible, the service that had made everything meaningful, the grandson who had inherited both. And it left Richard with exactly what he had earned, the fixed sum that was generous by any ordinary measure, and the knowledge of what the rest of it had been. Harriet had told her, at the close of their last meeting, that the paperwork was complete. Everything filed, everything registered, everything in its place. "You're done," Harriet said. "For now," Eleanor said. "Is there something else?" "The letter. He'll need to receive the letter." She thought about the timing of it. When, how, under what circumstances? Not yet. Not until there was a reason to send it. "I'll know when." Harriet looked at her for a moment. "You know, in 22 years, I've had clients who restructured out of anger, out of fear, out of spite. All of them. I've had clients who did it for love, for control, for ego, for legacy." She paused. "You're the first one who's done it because she understood the difference between what was owed and what was assumed. That's a rare thing." Eleanor considered this. "My husband taught me," she said. "He spent 30 years building something. He taught me that the only things worth building are the ones you can hand to the right people." She drove home along Birchwood Lane in the last of the afternoon light. The Volvo was warm. The sketch from Thomas was in the glove compartment, carefully folded. The tea she had brought to Harriet's office was finished. The study was waiting, where everything was in order. She did not yet know, as she pulled into the driveway, that she would receive a phone call in 3 days that would change the timing of everything. A call from a number she did not recognize at first, a voice she had not heard in many months, with information that would make the letter necessary sooner than she had planned. She did not know it yet, but she was ready. She had been ready for a long time. The number came in on a Thursday. Eleanor was on her way back from the reservoir walk, still in her coat, her shoes carrying the thin damp of the path along the water's edge, when the phone lit up in her pocket with a number she did not immediately recognize. Area code she knew. Prefix she did not. She almost let it go to voicemail. She did not. The voice on the other end was a woman's. Measured, professional, slightly hesitant in the way of someone who has rehearsed an uncomfortable call and is not sure how to begin it. "Is this Eleanor Voss?" "It is." "My name is Claire Saunders. I'm a realtor with Meridian Properties. I'm calling because—" A pause. The hesitation of someone deciding how much to say and in what order. "I had a listing inquiry this week for a property on Birchwood Lane, number 44. Eleanor stopped walking. The path continued ahead of her, the reservoir flat and gray in the November light, 2 other walkers moving in the middle distance, a dog running through the long grass at the water's edge. She stood very still. I see, she said. The inquiry came through an estate planning context. Someone looking into what the property might list for. Another pause. I want to be clear that nothing has been filed. Or nothing formal. I would never list a property without a signed agreement from the owner. But the name given as the contact was Richard Voss, and when I looked at the county records to verify ownership, I found the property registered to you. And the woman exhaled. I don't know your situation. I don't know what your family arrangements are. But I felt you should know that someone was inquiring about your home without it apparently being at your direction. The reservoir moved very slightly in the November wind. The dog in the distance disappeared into the grass and reappeared. How long ago was this inquiry? Eleanor asked. 3 days ago, Tuesday. Tuesday, 3 days after Thanksgiving, which Eleanor had spent at Beverly's house over roast chicken and the third volume of a collected letters anthology they had been reading together. 3 days after Richard had sent a text message that said, Hope you had a good day, Mom. We'll do something soon. Thank you, Eleanor said. Ms. Saunders, I want you to know that I appreciate this call very much. Of course. The relief in the woman's voice was genuine. I want to be clear. I didn't engage further with the inquiry. I wanted to speak with the owner first. You did exactly the right thing. Is there anything I can help you with? Eleanor looked at the reservoir for a long moment. The flat gray water, the bare trees on the far bank. A place she had walked every Thursday for 11 years, since the week after Arthur died. Say because walking it had been the first way she had found to be in motion when being in motion felt impossible. No, she said. You've done everything I needed. She thanked Claire Saunders again and hung up. She stood on the path for another full minute, which was not something she usually did, standing still in the middle of the walk, in the cold, with nowhere to be for another hour. She stood there and looked at the water and felt something she recognized as the last thing settling into place. Not anger. She had moved past anger some time ago, in the same way you move past a town you have driven through before, aware of it, recognizing it, not stopping. What she felt was the specific sensation of a door closing on a room you have spent a long time in and will not enter again. She walked home. She called Harriet from the kitchen while she was still in her coat. It's time to send the letter, she said. Harriet did not ask what had changed. She simply said, I'll have it couriered tomorrow morning. Do you want to be the one to tell him it's coming? No, Eleanor said. Let him find it. The letter arrived on a Friday morning, by courier, in a heavy cream envelope embossed with the name of Okafor Estate Partners. It was addressed to Mr. Richard Arthur Voss and marked Private and Confidential, which couriers take seriously, which meant it was signed for by Richard himself rather than left with the household. Eleanor knew this because Harriet had used a courier service that confirmed delivery with a timestamp and a photograph of the recipient's signature. She received the notification at 11:17 on Friday morning. She was in the study. She looked at the photograph of Richard's signature. His handwriting, which had always been slightly illegible, the Voss in a hurried, compressed scrawl. And then she put the phone face down on the desk and picked up the Maillart book. She had borrowed it from Thomas at the Sunday dinner. He had pressed it into her hands at the door. You should read it properly, not just the bits about the math. The bits about his life are the best parts. She read for an hour. She was 3 chapters in when the phone rang. She did not answer. It rang twice more in the next 20 minutes. Then a text message appeared. Mom, call me. Then another. It's important. Then, after a gap, a third. Please. She read the please carefully. She knew her son's written voice well enough to read registers in it, and the please was not the please of irritation or entitlement. It was something else, something she had not heard from Richard in some years. She called him back. He answered immediately. He had been waiting. Mom! His voice had a quality she had to work to identify for a moment, because it had been so long since she had heard it in this form, stripped of the practiced ease, the managed efficiency, the ambient self-assurance of a man who has always assumed the ground will hold. He sounded, she realized, young. Not young the way Thomas was young. Thomas's youth was forward-facing, full of the particular confidence of someone moving toward things. Richard sounded young in the other direction. We're young the way people sound when something has reminded them of what they don't know. I got a letter from an attorney, he said. I know. A silence. You sent it. I arranged for it to be sent, yes. Mom, he stopped. She heard him make a sound that might have been him sitting down, or leaning against something, or simply exhaling in the particular way of a man whose legs have gone uncertain. I don't understand. Which part? Any of it. The trust. It says Dad had 38%. That doesn't. I thought he owned the company. He did. As did I. My portion of the ownership was 38%. That was the agreement we made in 1987, which you can read in the attached documents if you'd like to verify it. You never said anything. No, she said. I didn't. Why not? She had thought about this question, had written the answer in the letter itself, had written it in the green notebook before that. She said it now in the way she had always said important things, without emphasis, without heat, simply as information being transferred from one person to another. Because your father and I watched, over a long period of time, the way you related to the expectation of things, and we made a decision that you would receive what you had earned, and that the rest would go where it was intended to go. We planned to tell you when it seemed right. Your father died before it seemed right, and then I needed more time to understand what right looked like. And now you understand? Yes. A long silence. She could hear him breathing. She could hear, faintly, there's the sound of the house around him, the particular ambient quiet of a house in the middle of a weekday morning. Cassandra at work, Thomas at school, only Richard in it with a letter that had rearranged his sense of the ground beneath him. Is this because of... He stopped again. Because of what, Richard? Another silence. And then, the phone, the call, in October. She let that sit for a moment. The acknowledgement that he knew, that some part of him had known, perhaps from the moment he found his phone still lit up with an active call after he had walked away from it. Perhaps from the quality of her voice the next time he had called back. Perhaps simply from the interior knowledge that people carry of the things they have said that cannot be unsaid. Yes, she said, in part. Mom, The word sorry was somewhere in the pause. She could hear it forming, and she made a decision, quickly and cleanly, to not receive it right now. Not because she did not want it. She did want it in the deep human way that mothers always want their children to mean the things they say. But because she had learned, with Richard, that the sorry that arrived in the first wave of shock was not the sorry that had been thought through, and she was not interested in anything that had not been thought through. I'm not asking you to say anything right now, she said. I'd like you to read the letter carefully, all of it, including the attached documents, and then I'd like you to think about it, not call me back in an hour. Think about it properly. Mom! Richard! Her voice was not unkind. It was what it had always been, clear, unhurried, certain. I love you. Why, I have always loved you. That isn't what this is about. Then what is it about? She looked at the photograph of Arthur on the study wall, the one from 1989, the year after Thomas's mother was born, the year the company was beginning to grow into something more than hope and overtime. Arthur, in his good jacket, standing in front of a building they had rented for the first real office, grinning slightly sideways in the way he grinned when he thought a photograph was being taken too seriously. It's about what things are actually worth, she said, and who they should go to. Your father built that company on a principle. Value what actually creates things, and honor it proportionally. He honored me that way. I've tried to honor it forward. By cutting me out. By redirecting what I built toward what I built it for. She paused. You're not cut out, Richard. Read the letter. You'll see the sum. It's a generous sum. But the rest? The rest goes where your father would have wanted it to go. The mathematics department at the university, the firefighter's pension fund, a boy who draws bridges and understands what holds things up. She let that last one land without explaining it. Read the letter. He was quiet for a long time. Does Cassandra know? He asked finally. She'll know when you tell her. She's going to... He stopped himself. Eleanor waited. I'll read it, he said. Good. And then can we talk? In person? She thought about this for a moment. Not whether she was willing. She had always known they would eventually sit across from each other and have the conversation that this one was only the edge of. But when and where? And what she wanted that conversation to contain. When you've read it, she said, and thought about it, not before. Okay, a pause. Mom? Yes. The realtor, did she call you? The question told her what she needed to know. That he had known exactly what he had done, from the first moment she said realtor, that there had been no misunderstanding to hide behind. She called me, Eleanor said. A silence so long and so complete that she could hear the house settle around him. I'm sorry, he said. This one she received. I know you are, she said. I'll hear the rest of it when you're ready to say it properly. Cassandra called on Saturday morning. Eleanor had been expecting this and had decided, some days before the letter was sent, what she would and would not say. She was not interested in a conversation with Cassandra before she had had the full conversation with Richard. She was not interested in Cassandra's version of what had happened, which would be a version optimized for Cassandra's position within it. She was not interested in managing Cassandra's feelings at the expense of the clarity she needed Richard to arrive at on his own. She let the call go to voicemail. The voicemail was 4 minutes long. She listened to it once while making tea, and then set the phone on the counter and finished making the tea. Cassandra was not without intelligence. She had understood, from the letter and from whatever conversation she'd had with Richard the previous evening, the broad shape of what had happened. The trust structures, the redirection of the estate, sees the fixed sum that was now Richard's ceiling, rather than a partial glimpse of a floor with no visible bottom. She had understood that the ground had shifted. What she had not yet understood, Eleanor thought, was that the ground had always been what it was. It was only the map of it that had been wrong. The voicemail used the word unfair 6 times in 4 minutes, which was informative in the particular way that a repeated word is always informative. She did not call back. She texted Richard, I received Cassandra's voicemail. When you're ready to talk, it should be the two of us first. Let me know. He replied within 10 minutes. Understood. I'll call you this week. She put the phone in her coat pocket and went to check on the roses. The meeting was Richard's idea, which was the first thing that had happened in the way Eleanor had hoped it would happen. She had not arranged it. She had not suggested it. She had not, after the Friday phone call, done anything to move the process along, except to be available when Richard called on the following Wednesday morning and said, in a voice that had been through something in the intervening days, I want to meet with you and the attorney, Harriet Okafor. I want to understand all of it. Harriet's conference room on the 3rd Wednesday of November. Richard arrived 7 minutes early, which he never did. Richard was a man who arrived at the time appointed, no earlier, as a point of self-governance. He was sitting in the chair opposite Harriet when Eleanor arrived, and he stood up when she came in. And the standing up had the quality of something he had decided to do rather than something he had simply done. She noticed. She did not say anything about it. Harriet ran the meeting with the brisk, compassionate efficiency of someone who had done this before. Not this specific meeting, but this category of meeting, the one where a family discovers what was always true about its own architecture. She had laid out the documents in the center of the table, the original trust agreements, The amendment filed in November, the will as updated, the beneficial interest registrations for the commercial properties, a summary prepared by Patricia Chen of the acquisition proceeds and their current management. Richard sat across from them and read. He read for 23 minutes. Eleanor knew because there was a clock on the wall of the conference room, a simple round one, and she found herself watching it in the way you watch clocks in rooms where something important is happening, not impatiently, but precisely, the way you note the time so that later you can say, "This is when it happened." He read the trust amendment. He read the will. He read the summary of the acquisition. He read the commercial property registrations, including the one for the building 3 blocks from where they were currently sitting, which produced a barely perceptible pause in his reading, a slight stillness, a fractional change in the set of his shoulders, before he continued. When he had finished, he set the last page down and looked at Harriet first, then at Eleanor. "The building on Calvert Street," he said. That's 3 blocks from here." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I've walked past it." "I expect you have." He looked at the table for a moment. Then he said, with the particular directness of someone who has given up the easier questions in favor of the necessary one, "How long?" "The trust was established 18 months ago, after the acquisition closed. The commercial properties have been in a trust structure since 2019. The ownership stake existed from 1987. 37 years. Yes. Dad knew. It was his arrangement, our arrangement." Richard was quiet. He had his hands flat on the table, not gripping it, not performing composure, simply still, a man who had decided to be in the room with what was true rather than scrambling toward an exit. She gave him credit for that. She had not been certain he would be able to do it. "The realtor," he said. "Yes. I should explain that." "You don't have to explain it to me," Eleanor said. "I understand what it was." He looked at her directly for the first time since she had entered the room. "I wasn't. I want you to know that I hadn't decided anything. It was a conversation. I wanted to know what the numbers looked like." "I believe you," she said. And she did, not because it changed anything, but because she had known Richard long enough to know that this was true. He had not decided to sell her house. He had been thinking about what it would be worth when she no longer needed it, which was a different kind of betrayal, but a betrayal of the same family. The easy assumption that the future would arrange itself conveniently around his preferences. "The phone call," he said. In October." "Yes." He pressed his lips together briefly. "I've been thinking about what I said. I've thought about it every day since I understood that you'd heard it." "Good," she said. "I can explain what I meant." "I know what you meant, Richard. You didn't have to mean something complicated for it to be true. You've gotten what you could out of her. That's what you said." Her voice was steady and unhurried. "I don't think you're a cruel man. I think you are a man who had been comfortable for a very long time and had stopped examining what that comfort was built on." He didn't speak for a long moment. "I know," he said finally. The 2 words were small and undefended, and she received them as such. Harriet had been sitting quietly during this exchange, her hands folded on the table, present without intruding. The skill of a person who understands when a conversation has moved past the legal and into the human, and knows that her role in the human part is only to hold the space. "I want to ask you something," Richard said, "and I want you to tell me the truth." "I always tell you the truth," Eleanor said. "That's been the problem, perhaps. I told it too quietly." "The money, the estate, He gestured at the papers. "Is there anything I could have done after Dad died? If I'd been different, if I'd come around more, asked different questions, not—" He paused. "Would it have been different?" She looked at him. Her son, 51 years old, sitting across a conference table from the woman who had taught him to read in the kitchen on Birchwood Lane, who had driven him to every practice and every exam and every airport departure in the years before he learned to dismiss those drives as simply what she did, who had pressed $40,000 into a check without asking to be thanked for it, who had stood in Arthur's garden for 30 years, maintaining roses she did not particularly love, because Arthur had. Yes, she said. It would have been different. He closed his eyes for a moment. I'm not telling you that to hurt you, she said. I'm telling you because you asked for the truth and you deserve it. The structure was built because your father and I made a judgment, over many years, about what you were likely to do with what you expected. And you confirmed that judgment. She paused. But judgments aren't sentences. They're observations. What you do from here, that's yours. He opened his eyes. He was looking at the window, at the city beyond it, at nothing in particular. Thomas, he said. Yes. The letter mentioned a trust for Thomas, separate from me. Separate from you, she confirmed. So he's taken care of. He is. Something moved across Richard's face. Complex, not quite readable. The particular expression of a man who is being grateful and ashamed simultaneously, who is relieved about something he also knows reflects poorly on why the relief is necessary. Okay, he said. Not the okay of someone who is done. The okay of someone who is beginning to understand where they are. Take as much time as you need with the documents, Harriet said. My office is available to you for any questions. Eleanor's position is documented and final, but I'm happy to walk through the reasoning with you at whatever pace is useful. Richard nodded. He looked at Eleanor. Can I? He stopped. Can I come by? To the house. Not to talk about this. Just. He looked at the table. I'd like to come by. She thought about the house on Birchwood Lane, the study where Arthur's books still stood in the order she had maintained for 11 years, the kitchen where the geranium still leaned toward the window, the garden where the late roses had finally finished for the year and were now bare canes against the November sky, patient and dormant, and still entirely capable of what they were made for. Yes, she said. Come by. He came on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks later, alone, without Cassandra, who was, as Richard had said on the phone, still working through things, which Eleanor understood to mean that Cassandra's process would be longer and different and would not be Eleanor's to manage. He came as she had asked, without an agenda. He came the way he had come as a boy, when he was small enough that the house on Birchwood Lane was simply where he lived and had not yet learned to relate to it as a resource. She made tea, the loose-leaf kind, Arthur's kind. She set out 2 cups on the kitchen table without asking if he wanted it, because it was cold outside, and he had come in from the cold, and that was what you did. They sat at the kitchen table. He talked. She let him. He talked about the letter, and about what it had taken him 3 weeks to understand about himself, the kind of understanding that does not arrive all at once but in pieces, in the night, in the middle of ordinary activities, when a thought surfaces that you have been avoiding and can no longer. He talked about his father, and about things Arthur had said to him when he was young that he had not understood at the time, and was beginning now to understand as a man who had missed the point and was circling back. He did not talk about the money. He talked around it, occasionally. The adjustment of expectation it had required, the conversation with Cassandra, the particular difficulty of looking at your own assumptions and recognizing their shape. But he did not ask her to change what she had done. He did not argue for a different distribution or suggest that she reconsider. She noticed this and gave him full credit for it. She told him about Arthur's roses. She told him the history of them, which she had never told him in full, the story of the graph paper plan, the specific variety Arthur had chosen, the summer he had nearly lost the whole bed to black spot, and had treated them with a patience that was entirely uncharacteristic, and had told Eleanor afterward, with great solemnity, that he had not understood roses before that summer, and now he did. Richard listened the way he had not listened to her in some years. With his full attention, without his phone, without the quality of a man who is already composing his next obligation. He would have been difficult to grow up with, Richard said, about Arthur, not critically, thoughtfully. He was, Eleanor said. He was also extraordinary. You can be both. Were you ever angry at him? Frequently. Richard smiled briefly, why in the way of a man hearing something that relieves him slightly. He was right more often than he was easy, Eleanor said. I eventually stopped needing him to be easy. She refilled their cups. Thomas called me, Richard said. Wednesday. He doesn't usually call midweek. He calls me on Thursdays, Eleanor said. He started doing it 2 years ago. Richard looked at her. I didn't know that. No. He absorbed this quietly, the fact of a relationship conducted in plain sight that he had simply not been paying enough attention to notice. What do you talk about? Books, mostly. Architecture, mathematics sometimes. He asks about Arthur. He's interested in how things are built. He's always drawing those bridges. Yes? Cassandra thinks it's a phase. Eleanor said nothing. The particular saying nothing of a woman who has an opinion she has chosen not to share, because sharing it would be unproductive, and the situation will resolve itself. Richard seemed to understand this. He looked at his tea. When he called Wednesday, Richard said, he told me something. He said, he paused. He said, Dad, you should go see Grandma E. Not because of the estate stuff, because she's your mom. He said it like it was obvious. He has a gift for the obvious, Eleanor said. It wasn't obvious to me. No, she said gently. It wasn't. Richard looked at her across the kitchen table. The same kitchen table where she had fed him breakfast for 18 years, sat where he had done his homework and read his first chapter book, and told her at 17 that he was in love with a girl from his biology class who had turned out not to matter at all in the end, where she had sat with him the night his father died and said nothing because there was nothing to say, and sometimes the most important thing a person can offer is their presence without words. I'm sorry, he said. I know I said it on the phone. I want to say it here, in this room. I'm sorry for what I said on that call. I'm sorry for the realtor. I'm sorry for the Sunday dinners, and for February instead of Thanksgiving, and for treating you like something that needed to be managed instead of someone who... He stopped, collected himself. You're my mother, and I handled you like an obligation. She looked at her son for a long moment. Xiao at the man he was, and the man he was trying to become in this room, in this conversation, with his tea going cold between his hands. I know, she said. Can you forgive me? She thought about forgiveness, what it was, what it required, what it cost. She thought about Arthur, who had believed that forgiveness was not a single act, but a decision you made repeatedly, in the small choices of daily life, until it became a fact rather than an aspiration. I can, she said. I will. It won't be instant, but it will happen. He nodded. He understood that this was not a performance. It was a statement of intention, which was more honest and more durable than anything easier. Start by coming to Sunday dinners, she said. Bring Thomas. Don't bring an agenda. He almost smiled. Just dinner, she said. We'll see what grows from that. Winter settled over Birchwood Lane the way it always did, without drama, in degrees, the temperature dropping a little more each week until the garden was fully bare, and the walks to the reservoir required the heavier coat and gloves and a thermos of tea, because Eleanor had learned that hot tea at the halfway point was not an indulgence, but a structural necessity for the second half of the walk. She began keeping a different kind of notes, not the careful record of observed behaviors, not the quiet documentation of a woman building her case. That notebook had served its purpose, and she had put it on the shelf beside Arthur's collected papers on systems architecture, where it belonged. She began keeping the other kind, So the kind she had always kept before Richard's treatment of her had required the more precise attention. Observations of the world, fragments of things she'd read, the kind of writing that a woman does when she is thinking clearly and wants to keep the thinking. Patricia called in December with the quarterly review. The portfolio had performed well. The commercial properties were generating their expected returns. Thomas's trust was established and funded. Everything was in order. "You sound like yourself," Patricia said at the end of the call. "I am myself," Eleanor said. "You sound more like yourself than you have in a while." "I've been in a particular kind of waiting mode," Eleanor said. "It's finished now. I'm in something else." "Something better?" "Something mine." Richard came to Sunday dinner twice in December. Once alone, once with Thomas, who arrived with a new sketchbook. Hardcover, the kind you could put in a bag without the pages bending, and spent an hour after dinner at the kitchen table, drawing the view from the study window, while Eleanor and Richard sat in the living room and talked, actually talked, in the tentative and genuine way of two people who have been estranged without quite admitting it, and are finding their way back to a language they share. It was not easy. The ease that exists between parents and children who have maintained real contact across the years was not available to them. That particular fluency requires maintenance, and they had let it lapse. What they had instead was the harder thing, the deliberate, slightly effortful conversation of two people who are choosing to be in a room together because they have decided it matters. Eleanor found she preferred it, actually, to what they'd had before. What they'd had before had been the performance of ease over a distance neither of them was acknowledging. This was the real thing, which required more, but meant more. Cassandra did not come in December. Eleanor had not expected her to, and Richard had not pressured it. That would be its own process, its own time. Eleanor was not in a hurry. Patience, as Arthur had always observed, was the skill that looked like waiting from the outside and felt like readiness from the inside. Beverly came for tea on the last Thursday before Christmas. They sat in the study where the books were, where Arthur's photograph was on the wall in the 1989 jacket. And they drank the good tea, and Beverly read aloud from the collected letters. Anthology, and outside the garden was bare and cold and completely still. "I have a question," Beverly said at the end of the reading. "Ask it. Did you plan all of it, from the beginning? Or did it happen in pieces?" Eleanor looked at the wall of books, the particular comfort of being surrounded by things that other minds had made. "Arthur planned the structure," she said. "I completed it. The timing was mine." She thought about the open phone call, the Tuesday morning in October, the tea going cold at the kitchen table. You can only plan so far. The moment shows you the rest. And the letter? The letter was always going to be written. I just needed to know it was time. Beverly nodded. She poured more tea. "Thomas showed me the drawing he made for you," she said. "The bridge. I have a copy on my refrigerator." "The math is behind the beauty," Eleanor said. "Yes." Beverly looked at her over the rim of her cup. That boy has understood something most people never get. That the things that hold are the things that were properly calculated. That elegance is not decoration. It's the proof that the calculation was right. Eleanor thought about the Schwanbach Bridge, spanning its mountain gorge in 1933. Robert Maillart and his precise, intuitive understanding of what forces were moving through a structure and how to honor them. The arch that looked like beauty and was, underneath, mathematics that had not been written down yet. He had simply known it deeply enough to trust it. She thought about Arthur, Sawkin and the company he had built on principles clear enough that the details had taken care of themselves. She thought about the 38%, which had never been a negotiation. It had been recognition. "I see what you contribute. Here is what that is worth. Let it be documented." She thought about Thomas at the kitchen table with his sketchbook, drawing the view from the study window, understanding instinctively that the way a thing is built is not separate from the thing it is. "He'll be all right," Eleanor said. "More than all right," Beverly said. "Yes, more than all right." It is spring on Birchwood Lane. The roses, Arthur's roses, the late blooming kind, have begun their first show of the year, cautious and definite, the way things begin when they have survived a winter and know their own strength. Eleanor cut 2 of them this morning and put them in a glass on Arthur's desk, where they stand in the particular slant of spring light that comes through the study window between 9 and 11, the best light in the house at this time of year. She has a call with Patricia this afternoon. The downtown building's lease comes up for renewal in July, and there is a question about the terms worth thinking through carefully. She has been thinking through it for 2 weeks. She has notes. She has a call with Thomas tomorrow morning. He is away at a summer program for students interested in architecture and structural engineering, and he calls more than weekly now, which she suspects the program's administrators have not accounted for, but which she enjoys deeply. And which have produced a series of voice memos she has been saving because the conversations are exactly the kind that deserve to be kept. She has a Sunday dinner with Richard in 10 days. He has been coming monthly. Cassandra came once, in April, an initial and somewhat careful visit that was not warm but was present, which Eleanor has accepted as the beginning of something. She will not rush it. She does not rush things that require time to become what they are going to be. She has dinner with Beverly on Thursdays, alternating houses, Beverly's dining room with the table that needs refinishing, Eleanor's study with the books. Beverly is working on a memoir, which she describes as strictly for myself, I'm far too private to publish, and which Eleanor suspects will be extraordinary. She has a letter from Thomas on the mantelpiece. Not a text message, a real letter, handwritten, sent from the summer program in the old-fashioned way. It is 3 pages, covering the mathematics of suspension bridges, a question about something she had mentioned about Arthur's early company days that Thomas wants to understand better, and a drawing of the view from his dormitory window. A water tower, 2 elm trees, and in the corner, in his small, even hand, "Thank you for the tea in the good cup." I understood what that meant. She has read it 7 times. She keeps it with Arthur's photograph and the My Art book, and the dark green notebook on the shelf in the study. And when she sits at Arthur's desk in the morning light, she can see all of them in the same glance, which seems right. A woman of 71, in a house on Birchwood Lane, with roses in a glass on the desk, and a quarterly call with her financial advisor, and a son who is learning, painstakingly and genuinely, what it means to see his mother as a person rather than a position. She is not naive about what is still difficult. She is not romantic about the distance that still exists. She does not mistake this for the end of a process. She has lived long enough to know that families do not resolve. They only shift. And what you get, if you are lucky and patient and honest enough, is a shift in the right direction. She has shifted things in the right direction. She sits at Arthur's desk in the spring light, with his roses and his books, and the letter from the boy who understood what the good cup meant, and she thinks about the principle she has operated on for the whole of her life, the one that Arthur recognized in her and honored, the one she taught Thomas without meaning to by simply being herself in his presence. The things that hold are the things that were properly calculated. She opens her green notebook to the next clean page. She writes the date. She begins. Thank you for staying all the way to the end. The people who finish the whole story are the ones who understand it, and the ones who carry it. If Eleanor's story moved you, if it found something in you that needed to be found, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, come back. There is always another woman the world underestimated. A woman who waited, who watched, who understood the difference between what was owed and what was assumed. And we tell those stories here, on Sarah Mitchell, where the woman they dismissed is always the one holding everything and the one who decides what it becomes.